Both McLarens were wiped from the results in a single night, and the entire championship exploded in a way no one expected. A few microscopic measurements under the cars changed everything and instantly reopened the world title fight with only 2 races left. You are about to hear how a quiet post-race inspection turned into the biggest twist of the season and handed Max Verstappen a lifeline that did not exist just hours earlier. Stay right here, because the impact of this ruling is so massive that it has rewritten the championship in a way that will shock every Formula One fan watching. The moment the officials completed their post-race inspection in Las Vegas, the paddock shifted from celebration to disbelief, because the data taken from both McLaren cars revealed a clear breach of the technical rules. The skid blocks positioned under the chassis had worn below the minimum thickness allowed, and that was a finding that no team can argue or negotiate. Once the readings were logged, the officials had only one possible decision, and that decision erased the results that Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri had earned on track. The shock traveled from the garages to the media room in a matter of minutes, because no one had expected such a dramatic reversal after such a straightforward race. As the news spread, it became evident that this was not a minor irregularity but a confirmed violation backed by repeated measurements taken with precision tools. The figures showed that the surfaces under both floors fell under 9 mm, which is the standard threshold required for compliance. This is one of the clearest rules in the book, because the underside of the car shapes the aerodynamic platform, and any extra compression at high speed can alter performance. For that reason, the officials do not consider intent or circumstance. They simply apply the rule. In this case, both McLarens failed the same test, and that created an extraordinary situation at a decisive point of the season. Throughout the night, analysts attempted to understand how such a failure could occur in a team that has been fighting at the top of the standings. McLaren had celebrated a second place for Norris and a fourth place for Piastri, yet under the surface the wear on the skid blocks told a different story. The measurements were taken in the presence of multiple team members who watched the officials repeat the procedure to eliminate any possible concern about accuracy. When the readings remained consistent, the team knew that the situation was irreversible. This is the brutal side of modern Formula One, where a few tenths of a millimeter can erase an entire weekend. When the final document arrived confirming the exclusion of both cars, the impact on the championship became immediately clear. Norris had been on course to extend his advantage to more than 40 points, and the team believed they had taken a major step toward securing the title. Instead, those points disappeared and the margin shrank to only 24, which placed Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri level behind the leader. This was not a gradual shift, but a sudden collapse of what looked like a stable championship position. In a season defined by small margins, this became the defining twist. The shock was felt not only inside McLaren but across the entire paddock, because this marked the first time in the modern era that a team lost both cars due to the same floor-related infraction in a race where the title fight was active. Teams and journalists immediately began recalculating scenarios and realized that Verstappen now held a genuine chance to change the direction of the championship. This kind of twist is rare, because the title picture usually evolves over weeks rather than being transformed in a single night. Yet here the standings were rewritten with one official document. As teams left the circuit, the conversation centered around the scale of the change and the psychological impact it would carry into the final 2 rounds. Verstappen left Las Vegas with a win and later discovered that his deficit had been cut to a far more manageable number. Norris left believing he had done enough to protect his lead, only to learn that his advantage had almost disappeared. This contrast created an emotional shift that will influence every strategic decision in Qatar and Abu Dhabi. The championship remains open because of one night when a small technical detail produced consequences that no one could predict. The officials recorded exact measurements under the McLaren floor, and those numbers created the foundation for the decision that reshaped the title fight. The skid block on Oscar Piastri's car produced readings of 8.96 mm on the front left, 8.74 on the front right, and 8.90 on the rear right. Every single value fell below the legal minimum of 9 mm. These figures were captured using equipment capable of detecting variations far smaller than the thickness of a human hair. When measurements like this are both precise and repeated with identical results, there is no route to challenge the findings. Lando Norris's car presented a similar pattern when the officials measured the critical points under his chassis. The readings of 8.88 mm at the front right and 8.93 mm at the rear right confirmed that the skid block on his car also sat below the permitted threshold. These measurements were made in the presence of McLaren representatives who monitored the entire procedure step by step. When the readings were repeated with new verification members present, the numbers remained constant. That consistency established the evidence as irrefutable and placed the officials in a position where the regulations had to be applied without negotiation. Because the skid block rule is one of the clearest in the technical code, the officials did not evaluate intention or evaluate whether the team had gained a systematic advantage. The rule exists to maintain consistency across all cars in situations where ground effect aerodynamics become sensitive to ride height variations. When the skid block is worn below the minimum, the car can achieve unintended performance benefits at high speed even if those advantages were not pursued deliberately. For that reason, the rule treats every violation equally and mandates disqualification without consideration for context. It is designed to protect the competitive balance of the entire grid. The timeline of the inspection added further drama because the announcement arrived more than 4 hours after the checkered flag. During that period, McLaren still believed that their second place and fourth place finishes stood as legitimate. Meanwhile, Verstappen had left the circuit already satisfied with a clean win but unaware that the entire structure of the championship was about to be rewritten. When the officials released the document confirming both disqualifications, it created an immediate scramble in the paddock as teams recalculated the points and journalists attempted to understand the scale of the shift. This was a moment where the administrative part of the sport carried greater impact than the race itself. Once the points were recalculated, the full consequence became clear. Instead of extending his lead to more than 40 points, Norris saw his total fall from a projected 408 to 390. Piastri fell from 378 to 366. Verstappen remained on 366 and therefore rose to joint second in the standings. A gap that would have been insurmountable now shrank to only 24 points, with 60 points still available across the sprint session and the final 2 races. These numbers transformed the conversation because Verstappen no longer needed miracles. He simply needed consistency and at least one mistake from McLaren. The mathematical shift also produced psychological pressure that will influence the final rounds. For Norris, the sense of control evaporated because his margin no longer allows room for even a single poor session. For Piastri, the path remains difficult but still possible if he finds a perfect run. For Verstappen, the picture changed entirely because he left Las Vegas understanding that the title window had reopened. These updated standings reflect the harsh reality of modern Formula One, where precision decides every point and where a few fractions of a millimeter can change the outcome of an entire season. The engineering foundation of this disqualification begins with the behavior of modern ground effect cars, which rely entirely on stable ride heights to control the airflow beneath the chassis. When a car runs lower than expected, the floor compresses more aggressively at high speed, and that increased pressure accelerates the erosion of the skid blocks. McLaren explained that throughout the Las Vegas weekend the team encountered levels of porpoising far greater than what their simulations predicted. This meant the chassis oscillated vertically at a frequency that pushed the floor into the asphalt repeatedly, which multiplied the rate of wear. In a sport where surface contact must be managed within tight limits, this single variable became a decisive factor. The limited practice running across the weekend made the situation even worse because the team had fewer laps to study how the car reacted to the track surface at race speed. The first day of running was heavily disrupted by adverse weather, and the second day included long stoppages caused by issues with the circuit infrastructure. As a result, the engineers could not refine the right height or validate their models with the usual level of precision. That left the team relying on incomplete data and forced them to base the race setup on estimates rather than full confirmation. In a championship fight, even small gaps in preparation can trigger large consequences. There was also the possibility of secondary floor disturbances caused by contact during the opening stages of the race. Oscar Piastri suffered an early collision that damaged his tire and forced him to pit before the strategic window opened. Although the primary damage was to the wheel assembly, the impact may have transmitted energy into the lower section of the chassis and changed the alignment of parts connected to the floor. Even a small shift can alter how the skid block presses against the ground. The officials acknowledged this possibility but emphasized that accidental damage does not change the obligation to present a conforming car at all times. The Las Vegas circuit itself magnified every one of these issues because its long straights produce extended periods of full throttle, which increases the downward load created by the aerodynamic platform. When a car remains at full speed for a large portion of the lap, the suspension stays compressed for longer and the skid blocks spend more time near the asphalt. This track characteristic becomes even more punishing when the tires do not degrade as much as expected because drivers can push more consistently. During the Las Vegas event, tire wear was significantly lower than predicted, which allowed both McLaren drivers to run at maximum attack for most of the distance. This increased the force applied to the skid blocks and helped produce the excessive wear. The officials followed the established procedure defined by the technical directive and repeated the measurements in the presence of additional McLaren members to ensure full transparency. Because the equipment used has a precision tolerance far below the scale of the violation, the inspectors were confident that the figures represented the true condition of the cars. The officials also referenced prior cases from earlier in the season where similar infractions resulted in identical penalties. This confirmed that the ruling had to remain consistent with precedent. The consistency of regulation is essential in a championship where competitive fairness depends on strict enforcement of technical rules.